Chapter 7, Parts 1, 2, and 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 7, Parts 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 7. The Perils of Greece, the Persian and Punic Invasions. We have now reached the threshold of the second and the greater Persian invasion, the second and the greater triumph of Hellas. The significance of this passage in their history was not lost upon the Greeks. Their defense of Europe against the barbarians of Asia, the discomfiture of a mighty oriental despot by a league of their free states, the defeat of a vast army and a large fleet by their far smaller forces, these surprises made an enduring impression upon the Greek mind, and were shaped by Greek imagination into a wonderful dramatic story, at a time when the critical instinct had not yet developed. No tale is more delightful than this tale as Herodotus tells it, when we take it simply as a tale, and none illustrates better the story-shaping genius of the Greeks. The historical criticism of it is another matter. We have to seek to extract what actually happened out of the bewildering succession of daring exaggerations, naive anecdotes, fictitious motives, oracles, not to speak of miracles, in most of which the reflected light of later events is visibly altering the truth, while much is colored by the prejudices and the leanings of the Athenians, from whom Herodotus seems to have derived a great part of his record. Section 1. The Preparations and March of Xerxes. The chief event in Persia during the 10 years which elapsed between the first and second invasions of Greece was the death of King Darius. After the unexpected repulse of his forces at Marathon, he had determined to repeat the experiment, and begun to make some preparations. 4 years passed, and then a revolt broke out in the province of Egypt which demanded immediate attention. But its suppression was delayed in consequence of the king's death, and was only accomplished under Xerxes, son of Atossa, who had succeeded to the throne. The question then arose, whether the design of an expedition against Greece, to avenge those who fell at Marathon, and to redeem the fame of Persian arms, should be carried out. It is related that Xerxes was himself undecided, but was over-persuaded by the impetuous counsels of his cousin Mardonius. On the other hand, his uncle Artabanus appears in the pages of Herodotus as the prudent and experienced adviser who weighs all the obstacles and foresees failure. Xerxes, swayed hither and thither between these opposing counsels, is finally determined to yield to the wishes of Mardonius by the peremptory command of a dream, which overcomes even the scruples of Artabanus. In this manner does Herodotus pretend to take us behind the curtain of the council chamber at Susa, representing, in the light of later events, the advice of Mardonius as youthful and foolish, although that advice merely amounted to the execution of the design which, according to Herodotus himself, the old and experienced Darius had initiated and prepared. Nevertheless, the contrast of Mardonius and Artabanus, and the dreams divinely sent with evil purpose, are, though not historical, a most effective dramatic introduction into the episode of the invasion. Further pressure was brought to bear on the king by Greeks who visited his court. Envoys from the Aluid princes of Thessaly, and members of the Pisistratid family, who brought with them the seer Onomacritus to impress Xerxes by favorable oracles. It was clear that the expedition must consist of a joint attack by sea and land. Preparations were begun by the difficult enterprise of digging a canal, about 1.5 miles long, across the isthmus of Mount Athos. On the occasion of the expedition of Mardonius to Thrace and Macedonia, it will be remembered that a large part of the fleet had been wrecked in rounding the dangerous headland. But was it necessary for the fleet to venture on this occasion within the proximity of Cape Athos? Might it not sail straight across the Aegean to Greece? On these grounds Herodotus suggested that the cutting of Athos was undertaken for display rather than from necessity. This is an unsound criticism. It was a fundamental principle of Persian strategy in these expeditions that the army and navy should cooperate and never lose touch. The Thracian expedition of Darius, the Macedonian expedition of Mardonius, the Greek expedition of Xerxes illustrate this principle. The canal of Athos was intended to ensure that the ships should safely accompany the land forces along the coasts of Thrace. It seems to be established that the work was completed and used, though later writers threw doubts on the velification of Athos. When it was finished, the workmen proceeded to lay a bridge over the Strymon for the passage of the army, and preparations were made all along the line of route for the feeding of a vast host. Xerxes came down from Susa to Sardis in the autumn. He met the oriental contingents of his army at Cratella in Cappadocia. At Carnae it is recorded that Pythius, the richest man in the empire, entertained at his own cost the king and the whole army. His wealth amounted to 4,000,000 gold darics. All but 7,000 he kept. Xerxes bestowed upon him 7,000 to make up for the spent sum. Xerxes spent the winter at Sardis. Pythius was so pleased with the king's graciousness that when the army was about to start for the Hellespont in the following spring, he ventured to proffer the request that the eldest of his 5 sons, who were serving in the army, might be permitted to remain behind. Great was the king's wrath at what he regarded as the insolent demand of a slave. The body of the eldest son was cut in two. One half was placed at each side of the gate of Sardis, through which the army was about to march forth. The anecdote illustrates the severity with which military service was enforced. It is impossible to suppose that the whole army wintered in Sardis with the king. It is probable that the place of mustering was at the Hellespont, across which 2 bridges had been constructed in the neighborhood of Sestos and Abydos by Phoenician and Egyptian engineers. But the strength of these bridges was not sufficient, and a tempest destroyed them. The wrath of Xerxes at this catastrophe was violent. He not only beheaded the engineers, but commanded that 300 lashes should be inflicted on the waters of the Hellespont. Those who carried out this strange order addressed the sea as they scourged it in these words: "O bitter water, our Lord lays this punishment upon thee, for having done him wrong who never did wrong to thee. King Xerxes will cross thee, whether thou wilt or not. Just is it that no man sacrifices to thee, for thou art a treacherous and briny river." These words are blamed by Herodotus as un-Greek and impious. The reconstruction of the bridges was trusted to new engineers. 2 lines of ships were moored across the strait by anchors at prow and stern. The line nearer to the Propontis consisted of 360, the other of 314, triremes and pentators mixed. Over each of these lines of ships 6 huge cables, 2 of flax, 4 of papyrus, were stretched, and in 3 places rows were left between the ships and under the cables for small paddling craft to pass between the Euxine and the Aegean. Planks were laid across the cables and kept in their places by a second tier of cables above. On this foundation a road was made with wood and earth, and on each side palisades were set, high enough to prevent the animals which passed over from seeing the water. On a marble throne erected on the shore, Xerxes is said to have witnessed the passage of his army, which began at the first moment of sunrise. The troops crossed under the lash, and the crossing was accomplished in 2 days. But when the size of the Persian host was magnified in later years to the impossible figure of 5 millions, the story was that the crossing of the Hellespont required 7 days and 7 nights, the favorite number of fiction, without a moment's pause. The army was joined by the fleet at Doriscus in Thrace. Fleet and army were henceforth to act together. In the plain of Doriscus, Xerxes reviewed and numbered his forces. What nation of Asia, asks Herodotus, did not Xerxes lead against Hellas? He enumerates 46 peoples, with a picturesque description of their array. The Persians themselves, who were under the command of Otanes, wore coats of mail and trousers. They had wicker shields, large bows, and short spears. The Medes, Scythians, and Hyrcanians were attired in the same way. Then there were the Assyrians with brazen helmets, linen cuirasses, clubs, lances, and short swords; Bactrians with cane bows; trousered Sakai with pointed hats and carrying axes, Indians clad in cotton, Caspians in goatskin, Serangians wearing dyed garments and high boots, Ethiopians clad in lion skins or leopard skins and armed with arrows whose stone points transport us to a primitive age, Sagartians with dagger and lasso, Thracians with fox-skin caps, Colchians with cowskin shields. The fleet was furnished by the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, Cilicians, Pamphylians, Lycians, Carians, and subject Greeks. It is said to have consisted of 1,207 warships, with 3,000 smaller vessels. A curious story was told of the numbering of the army. 10,000 men were packed together in a close space. A line was drawn round them, and a wall built. All the infantry passed successively into this enclosure. It was filled 170 times, so that the whole army of fighting men was 1,700,000. The number of the cavalry was 80,000, and there were some additional troops not included. Adding to these the crews of the ships, counting 200 to each larger and 80 to each smaller vessel, the total was obtained of 2,317,000 men. This enormous number was further increased by fresh contingents which joined during the march through Thrace and Macedonia. Besides the fighting men were a vast number of servants, sutlers, and camp followers, whom Herodotus considered to be quite as numerous as the soldiers. The whole host would consequently have reached upwards of 5,000,000, not including eunuchs and concubines. It is needless to say that these numbers are wholly fabulous. The facts which Herodotus states as to the number of the fighting men are false, and the principle of his conjecture that the total number of the host was double that of the fighting men is also fallacious. The picked body of 10,000 troops, called the Immortals, had the privilege of travelling comfortably with their wives and baggage. But this was an exceptional privilege, and it cannot be supposed that the mass of the troops were accompanied by servants. There is reason for supposing that the land forces may have amounted to 300,000, hardly more. A larger force than that would have been unmanageable in a small mountainous country, and the difficulties of provisioning even this were formidable. The number of the fleet must also be considerably reduced, perhaps to 800 triremes. From Doriscus, Xerxes proceeded to Therma with his fabulous host, in 3 divisions, drinking rivers dry in their march. At the crossing of the Strymon, near the place called the Nine Roads, he sacrificed 9 native youths and virgins. At Therma he was rejoined by his fleet, which had been separated from him while it sailed around Sithonia and Pallene. Most of the incidents which Herodotus recounts concerning this march of Xerxes are pleasing stories, designed to illustrate the historian's general view as to the great struggle of Greek and barbarian. The cruelty of Xerxes to Pythius, his barbarity and impiety in scourging the Hellespont, serve to characterize the barbarian and the despot. The enormity of the host which rolled over the straits to deluge Europe enhances the danger and the glory of Hellas, and to signify by a solemn portent the destined discomfiture of the Persian host, it is stated that as Xerxes was setting forth from Sardis, the sun was darkened. This eclipse actually happened 2 years later. The tradition which Herodotus follows transposed its date to an impressive and significant occasion. Section 2. Preparations of Greece. In the meantime, Greece was aware of the preparations of the great king for her enslavement, and was making her counter-preparations. The digging at Athos had warned her betimes, and the coming down of the king to Sardis showed that the danger was imminent. Xerxes is said to have dispatched from Sardis heralds to all the Greek states, except Athens and Sparta, to demand earth and water. These 2 cities now joined hands to resist the invasion. They were naturally marked out as the leaders of Greece, in Greece's greatest crisis. Sparta, by virtue of that generally acknowledged headship which we have seen; Athens, by the prestige which she had won in resisting the Mede at Marathon. They jointly convened an Hellenic congress at the Isthmus to consult on the measures to be taken for common resistance to the threatened invasion. We have already observed certain indications of the growth of a pan-Hellenic feeling, but this is the first instance of anything that can be described as deliberate pan-Hellenic policy. It is an attempt to combine all the scattered cities of the Greek world to withstand the power of Persia. It is a new fact in Grecian history, opening scenes and ideas unlike to anything which has gone before, enlarging prodigiously the functions and duties connected with that headship of Greece, which had hitherto been in the hands of Sparta, but which is about to become too comprehensive for her to manage. A large number of cities sent delegates to the congress, which was called the Synedrion of Prubuloi, or Congress of Representatives. It met at the Isthmus, a meeting place marked out by its central position, under the presidency of Sparta. There the states which were represented, 31 in number, bound themselves together in a formal confederation by taking a solemn oath that they would tithe those who uncompelled submitted to the barbarian for the benefit of the Delphic god. This was a way of vowing that they would utterly destroy such traitors. A great many states, the Thessalians, most of the Boeotian states, besides the smaller peoples of northern Greece, Locrians, Malians, Achaeans, Dolopians, and others, took no part in this congress. Their inaction by no means meant that they had made up their minds to Medize. They were only waiting to see how things would turn out, and, considering their geographical position, their policy might be justified by the natural instinct of self-preservation. These northern states would be the first invaded by the Persian, and it was hopeless for them to think of withstanding him alone. Unless they could absolutely rely on Sparta and her confederates to support them in defending the northern frontier of Thessaly, nothing would be left for them but to submit, and with this prospect it would have been imprudent for them to compromise themselves by openly joining the confederacy. Events prove that if they had seriously relied on that confederacy throwing all of its strength into the defense of northern Greece, they would have been cruelly deceived. As we shall see, they were ready to resist so long as there were hopes of support from the stronger states. In some cases there were parties or classes who were favorable to the Persian cause. For example, the oligarchs of Thebes and the Alaudae of Thessaly. One of the great hindrances of joint action was the existence of domestic disputes. There were feuds of old standing between Thessaly and Phocis, Argos and Lacedaemon, Athens and Aegina. The Congress attempted to reconcile such feuds, and Athens and Aegina laid aside their enmity to fight together for Grecian freedom. Another important question concerned the command of the confederate forces. The claim of Sparta to the leadership of the army was at once admitted. The question as to the fleet was not so clear. Sparta was not a naval power, and Athens, which would furnish more ships than any other state, had a fair claim. But the other cities were jealous of Athens. They declared that they would submit only to a Spartan leader. The Athenian representatives, when they saw the feeling of the allies, at once yielded the point. The Congress made some other provisions. While spies were sent to observe the preparations of Xerxes in Asia Minor, envoys were sent forth to various Greek states to enlist new confederates, to win over Argos, who had sent no delegates to the Isthmus, and to obtain promises of assistance from Crete, Corcyra, and Syracuse. None of these embassies led to anything. Gelon, the great tyrant of Syracuse, was himself absorbed by the prospect of an attack of the Carthaginians, and even if he had wished, could have sent no aid to the mother country. When the military preparations for the defense of Greece were made, and the generals appointed, the Congress of Representatives probably met again in spring, and then consigned the conduct of the affairs to the military congresses of the commanders, who used to meet together and decide on each movement under the presidency of the Spartan leaders. King Leonidas was the leader of the confederate army, and Eurybiadus, a Spartan, who did not belong to either of the royal families, was commander of the confederate fleet. The Greeks had abundance of time for their preparations, for strengthening their defences and building new ships. Athens probably threw herself with more energy into the work than any other city. One wise measure shows that she had risen to a full apprehension of the truth, that a solemn hour in her history had arrived. She recalled those distinguished citizens whom the vote of ostracism had driven into banishment during the last 10 years. Aristides and Xanthippus returned home. Their feuds with Themistocles were buried in the presence of the great danger, and the city seems to have shown its confidence in their patriotism by choosing them as generals. These leaders will each play his part in the coming struggle. Section 3. Battles of Thermopylae and Artemisium. About the time when Xerxes reached the Hellespont, the Thessalians sent a message to the Confederacy, suggesting that the pass of Tempe should be defended against the invading army. Accordingly, 10,000 hoplites were sent. But when they arrived at the spot, they found that there were other passes from Macedonia into Thessaly by which the Persians would be more likely to come. There were passes of Wolistana and Petra, which descended into the valley of the river Titaresius, and it was by one of those that Xerxes actually marched. 10,000 hoplites were not enough to defend the three passes, and it seemed useless and dangerous to occupy this advanced post. Hence the defense of Tempe was abandoned, and the troops left Thessaly. This desertion necessarily drove all the northern Greeks between Tempe and Thermopylae to signify their submission to Xerxes by the offering of earth and water. The next feasible point of defense was Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the sea and mountain, separating Thracis from Locris. It was the gate to all eastern Greece south of Mount Oeta. At the eastern and at the western end of the pass, in those days, was extremely narrow, and in the center the Phocians had constructed a wall as a barrier against the Salian incursions. Near the western end was Anthela, the meeting place of the Amphictyotic Council, while on the Locrian side one emerged from the defile near the village of Alpanoi. The retreat of the sea and consequent enlargement of the Malian plain have so altered the appearance of this memorable pass that it is hard to recognize its ancient description. The hot sulphur springs from which it derived its name and the sheer mountain are the two prominent features. It was possible for an active band of men, if they were debarred from proceeding by Thermopylae, to take a rough and steep way over the mountains and so reach the Locrian road at a point east of Alpanoi. It was therefore needful for a general who undertook the defense of Thermopylae to secure this path, lest the detachment should be sent round to surprise him in the rear. The Greeks determined to defend Thermopylae, and Leonidas marched thither at the head of his army. He had about 7,000 men, including 4,000 from Peloponnesus, 1,000 Phocians, 400 Thebans, 700 Thesbians, and Locrians in full force. It is possible that there may have been some other Boeotians who were not mentioned. Of the Peloponnesians, more than half were Arcadians. Mycenae, free at this moment from Argive control, sent 80 men. There were Corinthians and Thessalians, 1,000 Laconians, and 300 Spartans. So far as the Peloponnesians were concerned, this was only a small portion of their forces, and we may suspect that but for Athens they would have abandoned northern Greece entirely and concentrated themselves at once on the defense of the isthmus. But they were dependent on Athens because her fleet was so strong, and they were therefore obliged to consider her interests. To surrender Thermopylae and retire to the isthmus meant the surrender of Attica. But the hearts of the Spartans were really set on the ultimate defense of the isthmus, and not on the protection of the northern states. Their policy was narrow and Peloponnesian. They attempted to cover this selfish and short-sighted policy by the plea that they were hindered from marching forth in full force by the celebration of the Carnean festival, and that the Peloponnesians were delayed by the Olympic games. They alleged that the soldiers of Leonidas were only an advance guard, the rest would soon follow. Yet the feast did not interfere with the movement of the Confederate fleets. As the land arm and the sea arm of the Persian forces always operated together, it was necessary that while the Greek hoplites held the pass under Mount Oeta, the Greek triremes should oppose the Persian fleet in the straits between Euboea and the mainland. The Persians would naturally attempt to sail between Euboea and Magnesia into the Malian Gulf, and thence, accompanying the advance of the army along the western shore of the Long Island to the Euripus. The object of the Greeks was to prevent this, and support the garrison of Thermopylae by controlling the Malian Gulf. The Greek fleet, which numbered 324 triremes and 9 pentaconters, the Athenians contributing 200, chose its station near Artemisium on the north coast of Euboea. 3 ships were sent forward to reconnoiter on the Thermaic Gulf, and 2 of them were destroyed by the Persians. This was the first collusion in the war. The incident is said to have so depressed the Greeks that the whole squadron sailed back to the Euripus, but this is highly unlikely, for it was bound to remain at the mouth of the Malian Gulf so long as Leonidas held Thermopylae. It was, however, necessary that the Euripus should be guarded, for there was the possibility that the Persians might send round a detachment by the south of the Euboea, and so cut off the retreat. As 53 Athenian ships were absent during the first conflicts at Artemisium, and may be supposed that they were deputed to the service of keeping watch at the Euripus. In the month of July, the Persian army arrived at Thermopylae, and the Persian navy at the Magnesian coast between Casthanæa and Cape Sepias. Their ships were so many that they could not all be moored at the shore, and they had to range themselves in 8 lines parallel to the coast. While they were in this unsafe position, a great storm rose and destroyed, at the lowest computation, 400 ships. Thus the gods intervened to lessen the inequality between the Persian and Greek forces. Encouraged by this disaster, the Greek fleet returned to its station at Artemisium. In this account of Herodotus, the main fact is that the Persians suffered serious losses by a storm off the Magnesian coast. But the loss is exaggerated in proportion to the exaggeration of the original size of the fleet, and the movements of the Greeks are probably misrepresented. The story goes on that, cowed by the numerical superiority of the Persians, even after their losses, the Greek commanders wished to retreat again and were restrained from doing so by Themistocles. The Euboeans were naturally anxious that the fleet should remain where it was, as a protection to themselves, and to secure this they gave Themistocles 30 talents. Of this sum Themistocles distributed 8 in bribes to his colleagues and kept the rest. The facts of this case throw doubt on this story, which was probably suggested by what happened some weeks later at Salamis. For Eurybiadus and the Peloponnesians were bound to stay at Artemisium so long as the land army was at Thermopylae. After the storm, the Persians took up their station at Aphetae. They determined to cut off the Greek retreat, and secretly sent a squadron of 200 vessels to sail round Euboea. The news of this movement was brought to the Greek camp by Scylaeus of Scione, the most remarkable diver of his time, who plunged into the sea at Aphetae, and did not emerge above water until he reached Artemisium at a distance of 10 miles. Herodotus indeed hesitates to accept this tale, and records his private belief that Scylaeus arrived at Artemisium in a boat. The Greeks decided that when midnight had passed they would sail to meet the ships which were sailing to the Euripus, but in the afternoon they attacked the enemy just to see how they fought, and they succeeded in capturing 30 Persian ships. The night was very stormy. The gods had again intervened to aid Greece. The 200 ships, having rounded the southern cape of Euboea, were wrecked off the dangerous coast known as the Hollows. Immediately afterwards, the 53 Attic ships, which had not yet appeared at Artemisium, arrived there, and at the same time came news of the disaster. The Greeks consequently gave up the intention of retreating. There was some further fighting, with loss on both sides, but no decisive advantage, according to the Greek account, but we may suspect that the Persians had the best of it. Meanwhile, Leonidas had taken up his post at Thermopylae, and the Phocians, who knew the ground, had undertaken the defense of the byroad over the mountains. The old Phocian wall in the center of the pass was repaired. It was a serious matter for even such a large army as that which now encamped in the Malian plain to carry the narrow way of Thermopylae against 6,000 determined men. For 4 days Xerxes waited, expecting that they would retreat, awed by the vision of his mighty host. On the 5th he attacked, and in the engagements which took place at the west end of the pass, the Hellenic spearmen affirmed their distinct superiority to the Asiatic archers. On the following day the result was the same. The immortals themselves made no impression on the defenders. Herodotus says that Xerxes sprang thrice from his throne in agony for his army. It was then decided to send round the immortals, hardly the whole 10,000, under their commander Hydarnes, by the mountain road to take the Greeks in the rear. A Malian Greek named Ephialtes guided the band, and so won the name of having betrayed Greece. At dawn they reached the highest point in the path, where the Phocians were posted. The Phocians fled to the heights, and the Persians went on, paying no attention to them. Meanwhile deserters informed Leonidas of the Persian stratagem. He hastily called a council of war. The exact plan of action which was decided on is unknown. We only know that the Spartans, Thebians, and Thespians remained in the pass, while the rest of the Greeks retired southward. It was afterwards represented that they had deserted the defense of the position and returned home. But in that case it was foolish, if splendid, of Leonidas to hold the pass between foes on both sides. The rational courses were either for the whole garrison to abandon the pass, or else, just as the Persians aimed at enclosing the Greeks, so enclose the band of Hydarnes. We may suspect that the second plan was actually adopted. While part of the force, including Leonidas and the Spartans, remained in the pass, the rest, we may suppose, placed themselves at some distance east of the point where the mountain path descended to the road, so as to take Hardanes in the rear. Of the 1,400 who stood in the pass, some had to guard the eastern entrance against Hardanes, others the western against the main army. Leonidas and his 300 undertook the western side, but they were no longer content with merely repelling assaults. They now rushed out upon their enemy. Their charge was effective, but Leonidas himself was slain, and a Homeric battle raged over his body. 2 brothers of Xerxes fell. Many Persians were driven into the sea. But at length the defenders were forced back behind the wall. They drew together on a hillock where they made a last stand, to be surrounded and slain by overwhelming numbers. For the Immortals, having in the meantime routed the Greeks in their rear, had now forced their way into the pass. It was said that 4,000 Greeks fell. The valiant defence of Thermopylae made a deep impression upon Greece, and increased the fame of the Spartans for bravery. It was represented as a forlorn defence, Leonidas and his band devoting themselves to certain death, and clinging to their posts from that sense of military duty which was inculcated by the Spartan system from early youth. The brave Thesbians would not desert the Spartans, while the Thebans were represented as detained by Leonidas against their will because they were suspected of secret Medism. The malicious tale adds that, having taken only a perfunctory part in the defence, the Thebans advanced to the enemy and asked for quarter, declaring that they were friends of the great king and had come to Thermopylae against their will. Their lives were spared, but all, including the commander, were forced to suffer the shame of being branded as bad slaves. It is certain that this contrast between the Thesbians and Thebans was invented in the light of the subsequent Medism of Thebes. Nor is it clear that the defence of Thermopylae, although eminently heroic, was, until the very end, desperate. If, as we suspected, an effort was made to meet the Immortals, then, if that effort had been more effectual, it might have been possible to hold the pass, and in that case a naval battle must have decided whether the Persians or the Greeks would be forced to retreat. A column was afterwards erected at Sparta with the names of Leonidas and his 300. Among them was to be read the name of Diacones, reputed as the author of the famous mot which displayed the lightheartedness of a Spartan soldier in the hour of peril. When it was observed to him that the Persian host was so enormous that their arrows hid the sun, he replied, "So much the better. We shall fight in the shade." The news of Thermopylae speedily reached the fleet at Artemisium. The Greeks forthwith weighed anchor and sailed through the Euripus to the shores of Attica. End of Chapter 7, Parts 1 through 3.